This is the Recivilized podcast with your host, Chris Sharukas. On the podcast, I talk with bright and sensible people about how we can create a better way of life. This session features Shelley Aloi, a former Alderwoman for the city of Frederick, Maryland. She's here to talk with me today about the importance of a strong spiritual orientation in the public sphere. Shelley, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, me too. So let me start you off with an initial question. What did you do as an alderwoman for the city of Frederick?
So at the time, alderman, now called city council, that was the legislative side of city government. And so we were making budgetary decisions and legislative decisions for the city of Frederick.
Okay.
The second largest municipality, incorporated municipality in the state of Maryland.
Mm-hmm. So give me an example of something you would do day to day as an alderwoman.
Meet with constituents and have lots of people coming to get me on board with whatever their ideas were. Could be developers, could be people with just an idea for something to happen in the city of Frederick. I also was on the taxi cab commission, so we were overseeing the taxis in the city of Frederick. And, another piece that I did that was quite a bit of fun was I was the vice chair for the Washington Area Council of Governments Chesapeake Bay and Water Resources Policy Committee. That's a mouthful.
That sounds really exciting. That sounds like a bureaucratic party if I've ever heard one.
Well, it could be, and it was in some regards, but I'll tell you what we did is we were able to get the ear of EPA officials who were driving all of these policies that cost city governments lots and lots of money. They weren't considering the impact on local municipalities, and so we were able to get their ear and have them to realize exactly what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds very important.
It was.
So let's say I live 3 blocks down. My neighbor's cat keeps yowling all through the night. I say, Alderwoman Aloi, can you help me out here? What would you say?
Well, we'd have a conversation, and to be honest, there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. We can call the people with the decibel meter because there is a legislation about decibels, but no one ever does that, and those kinds of things are really difficult to enforce. You can go to the neighbor and say, "Will you please?"
Okay. So what are you up to these days?
I am the executive director of the Marriage Resource Center of Frederick County, and I also, just for fun, drive a little Uber on the side. Isn't that interesting?
I love it. So we're here to talk about spirituality in the public sphere. Mm-hmm. What is your spiritual background and faith?
My first memory of anything having to do with faith is when I was 4 years old. My mother took us to the Presbyterian church downtown on 2nd Street, and my Sunday school teacher that day was actually our next door neighbor, Mrs. Woodrow. And I remember it clear as a bell because she asked me in front of the other children, "What is it that I do?" She used to make a little movement with her mouth. And I was so shy, I was afraid to do it until she moved on, and then I wanted to show her. But, I was raised in the Presbyterian church downtown, and I recall at the time loving some things about it, but seeing a separation, meaning I saw through my teenage years there was church life and then there was real life, and I didn't make a connection that the two were integrated. That didn't happen until right after college, when I was invited to a Bible study, and I actually went because I liked a boy that was going to be there. But for the first time in my life, I felt the tangible love of God through a group of people. They didn't know who I was. They had not met me before, short of two of the folks there. And I just remember being warmly embraced, not physically, but welcomed into that group of people in a way that I liked. And so I began to go to church with them. That particular church was what some might call holy rollers. They were Pentecostal, and I remember the first time I went to their church, I sat in the back with my eyes open and probably my mouth open too, because it was kind of surprising and very different.
Oh yeah,
But,
I've been to a Pentecostal service or two. Yeah, my friends keep asking me, "Hey, are they the people with the snakes?"
do you know? I saw a YouTube podcast, recently about that, about a guy who really does that. But some of them do. I think they're in the mountains of West Virginia.
Exactly.
Primarily.
I told my friends, I was like, "Yeah, you got to go to West by God, Virginia for the snakes. You're not going to get them in Frederick."
Yeah, I haven't seen it here. But the short of the story is, this many decades later, I can go to that little church, and that same love of the people is present in a really powerful way.
Well, let me just make an observation that you are a part of that, because I remember visiting the Evangelical Ministerial Fellowship here in Frederick, of which you're a part, and I got that same feeling. I felt very welcomed. I felt what we call the Holy Spirit, and it felt pretty good.
Yeah. There's a real power to that, Chris, when people just care about one another, and I think about when the disciples were following Jesus, and the first time that they were called Christians was because they loved one another. And that's I think something that people long for, is just to be loved, to be cared for. And when we demonstrate that in the body of Christ, it's powerful.
Well, that leads me into my next question for you. How have you expressed your faith, your Christian faith, in your public life?
Wow.
And the reason I ask that is because there aren't too many people who have a foot in both camps. It's usually you're in government or you're in your clergy. And there aren't too many people who move in both worlds, but you do. And that's why I wanted to ask that question.
So I pause a little bit here because my mind immediately goes back to 2008, 2009, and how I actually entered the political arena. That's the year that I did Leadership Frederick County, which is a program under the covering of the Chamber of Commerce. But it was our state and local government days that kind of stirred my heart in that direction. I'd been a voter. I'd voted since I was eligible to vote and had participated in that way, but I didn't really understand what's behind that. Like, what are the people in government doing? And I was intrigued. And in addition to that, my colleagues in the class said, "Hey, you would be really good at that." So it planted a seed in me. And I remember it was the end of June that year. We had graduated from Leadership Frederick County, and I was actually at my house praying. And I prayed about this thing in government. The filing deadline for aldermen in the city of Frederick was approaching. And prior to that, I had spent many years doing short-term mission work and service work around the world in different countries and in the United States. But I felt like, not an audible voice, but I felt like the Lord spoke to my heart and said, that will be a natural next step in serving people. And so I ran for office and I won. No, I don't think I've fully answered your question, but there's something about being with people, and no matter where they come from, what political perspective folks come from, hearing them, like when people are heard, there's something about that that's powerful. And so I would say that's how I express that in the public arena, or one of the ways.
Yeah, I've noticed that people with a strong spiritual foundation seem to be more engaged. They're generally better listeners than the general public. I've noticed that. And I imagine that your constituents really appreciated that.
Perhaps some, perhaps not. There's no way to really gauge that, but anecdotally, perhaps.
Yeah. So it's helped you help other people by figuring out what's going on with them. If they have a problem, how would you describe that in Christian terms? That that willingness to meet them where they are, to really listen to what they're saying.
Do you know, there are a couple of scriptures that come to mind. One is that there's no greater love than one to lay down their life for a friend.
Mm.
And the other thing that comes to mind is as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me, to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at some people who are in positions of power, and they don't really, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but many people do not take time to stop for the guy who's on the bike that doesn't have a car, that doesn't make a whole lot of money. And some of those experiences for me have been really powerful. You know, I met a gentleman at the post office one day. He was on a bike, and he didn't have much, and we just had the most beautiful conversation, and I run into him regularly. As a matter of fact, just 2 days ago, he was riding his bike up the hill to the Prospect Shopping Center. And we just had the most beautiful conversation, and that man carries the light of the Lord, and he doesn't have much of anything.
I've had a similar experience, and interestingly enough, I was on my bike. I was riding my bike out to the, this is sort of tangential to the theme of our podcast today, but I want to echo what you said. So I made a trip out to Lowe's one day, and I was having a rough day. And I was on my bike, and the one guy in the parking lot said, you can't park your bike there, and I got all snitty. And the guy who handled the shopping carts came up to me, an older gentleman, obviously not well heeled. I mean, you know, he's arranging shopping carts in the parking lot of the Lowe's. And he just kind of looks at me and goes, "It's going to be okay. Whatever's going on with you, it's going to be all right."
Yeah.
And he said it with such conviction. It was arresting. I said, "What is going on here?" And when he said that, it was a very gentle voice, but he was intent. He had something to tell me. He had a message to impart. And I thought, okay, I'm getting some divine guidance here. Dad needs to settle down and take it easy.
That's powerful, isn't it?
It certainly was.
Do you know, I had a similar experience in the other big box store back in the millwork aisle, and somebody that I had been acquainted with but didn't really know well began to speak to me and it sounded like it was a word from the Lord, and it was quite empowering. And another time, I said that I drove some Uber for fun. I was in Baltimore, and you know, in that environment, you get all kinds of neighborhoods, and I will tell you, I've been to every possible neighborhood there. And usually, what will happen is people will tell me their stories, and often we have an opportunity to pray with one another. It's quite powerful. But I recall 2 instances in particular when the person got in the car and they spoke to me or prayed with me. And you never know when these things might happen, but God tends to stir the heavens at exactly the time when we have need and when others have need, if we'll just listen.
Well, I'll tell you, you gave me an idea. I pulled a muscle in my back last weekend, and I'm still having trouble getting around. And I thought, oh, man, am I going to be able to make it to Mass on Sunday? Well, it turns out I don't have to. I just need to call you and you drive me around an Uber, and and I'll get the equivalent. So let's get down to brass tacks here. The theme of the central theme of this podcast. Why is it so important for a society to have a spiritual foundation?
Do you know, I think back to the folks who founded this nation. And this nation was founded, regardless of the things you hear in the popular conversation these days. That's a whole nother conversation. This nation was founded with faith in mind. And I think about before George Washington was taking office, for the 2 weeks before that, there were announcements in the New York newspapers calling all of the citizens to pray for this nation. And when George Washington was sworn in, his first act as the president of this nation was to bow his knee in prayer. And he asked for divine providence to guard over this nation. His prayer was quite a bit longer than that. But when you study the original writings and the things that happened, you can find literally thousands of calls to prayer in those early days of this nation. And in its first 50 years, this nation was competing with the nations of the world that had been established for centuries. And how was that? There were 2 volumes written, and I should have that with me, but I need my phone to Google it. There were 2 volumes written about the success of this nation and how astounding it was, and it had to do with the people and its churches. Isn't that interesting? The people and its churches.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting.
Yes, and what's there? There is this powerful thing that happens when we believe God, when we believe the promises of Scripture, and when we live accordingly.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of something. Reminds me of something that Oswald Spengler wrote, the historian. He wrote that the people tend to take on characteristics of the specific land they live in. So, like, every land has puts its own mark on the people who live there. Mm-hmm. In Russia, it's this idea that we're all in this together. It seems that in the United States, the land has a somewhat different character. It gives us a different vibe, you might say, and it's more individualistic. But I think it's also, there's a spirituality here. For example, in the Ohio Valley, the Osage tribe lived from about 800 BC on, and every single member of the tribe was encouraged to pray for an hour every morning. They would wake up at sunrise and they would pray for an hour a day. That was, yeah. So, and what you said reminded me of that. And I think there's something about America that is spiritual. And I think the point you were making, that the spirituality of early American society had a great deal to do with its success. I think that's valid.
Yeah, and if you think about this last, I don't know, let's say back to the 60s, there was this intentional effort to remove anything having to do with God from the public arena. Prayer was removed from schools. This conversation about separation in church of state, which, by the way, when you study the history, is an upside down conversation, because what was really intended by that is that the state would not tell the people how to worship, that the people could worship in the way that they saw fit, which is the whole reason that people came here in the first place, for that
Absolutely.
Sort of religious freedom.
Hey, Maryland, Catholics welcome.
Yes. Well, take that. The Maryland Constitution opens by saying, "We, the people of Maryland, grateful to God Almighty for our civil and religious liberty." That's the opening of our Constitution. Yeah. And then in one of the articles, I believe it's Article 26, it says, "For it is the duty of all men to worship God in the manner that he deems most beneficial to him." Right in our Maryland Constitution. Now, if there was supposed to be a separation of church and state, why is that there? It's, it's a lie. It's not true.
That's an excellent point. Okay, so we've got a very spiritual nation in the first 50 years of its existence. And that basically persists up through the 60s. Since then, things have gotten weird.
They have.
Why the shift? Why was spirituality excised from public life starting in the 60s?
Well, I don't know. I was born in 1960, but I don't remember, all those things that happened. But I do know this. In 1963, there was a Democratic congressman, I believe he was from Florida, who read 45 tenets of communism into the congressional record. And he read it in there as a warning to the nation, like, watch out for these things. And there were some specific things in there. Actually, it's really interesting. There were several things in those 45 tenets of communism that we see in effect today. As a matter of fact, if you talk to different people, you'll hear that today in 2025, 42 of those 45 tenets have either been instituted in our nation or they're in progress. And it's kind of shocking.
Yeah, actually, what you said just reminded me of something, and that's so the leading lights of communism that sort of sprung up after communism started to decline worldwide. They started to gain traction here, and one of the things that they typically tried to do was, actually, I should say, job one was to get rid of religion, because they knew that as far as a barrier to communism went, that was the big one.
Well, let me say yes. And on this topic, when God is pulled out of the society and there's, an apprehension about having that conversation, it creates a void. Prior to that, let me use my my great Aunt Lucy for a moment. She was born in 1919, and she lived to be almost 98 years old. She had a scrapbook, and in the scrapbook she had postcards that my great uncle had sent her from World War II. And one of those postcards had the picture of the world, and it said, "Fighting for God and country," and it had all the branches of the military there, but on top of the world it had a picture of Jesus with his arms outstretched. And I said to her, I said, "Where in the world did you get this?" She said, "George sent it to me." I said, "Well, where in the world did he get it?" And she said, "Probably at the commissary." It was standard issue military postcard. We don't see that today. As a matter of fact, some of my friends who are military chaplains in certain places have been told that they can't preach Jesus. What is that? What is that?
It's strange is what it is.
So when that void is there, people are looking for other things to fill it, and when there's nothing to fill it, we see a lot of the woes that we see in society today. And in particular, I'm thinking about this next generation of young people. There's nothing to believe in, and when there's nothing to believe in, there's sadness, there's depression, there's a lack of identity. We need something to believe in.
Yes. Pope John Paul II said that the church is functioning as a sort of field hospital, and it's treating people who've been spiritually and emotionally brutalized by modern society.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. What is it about Christianity that produces such vibrant societies?
I don't know that I'm the authority on this. Maybe, perhaps there's a theologian or someone a little more versed. But
well, let me tell you why I asked that question. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at history, as I did. I was a history major in college. And, the Middle Ages tend to get short shrift. I mean, in most of the universities, we've got, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome, and then boom, and then we get to the Renaissance. And it's like, okay, and then we had the Dark Ages, people bleeding each other with leeches and not bathing for 3 years. But That's all wrong. The Middle Ages was an amazingly advanced time in terms of philosophy, spirituality, culturally. People thrived. And you look at the great cathedrals and how sophisticated they were and how beautiful they were and how beautiful the towns were around them. And it makes you wonder, what motivated that? What was the driving force? What underlying philosophy and faith could have inspired such beauty?
Yeah, do you know, that's really, excuse me, that's really interesting. I happened to be at the National Cathedral last week, and I hadn't been there for, like, probably 20 years. And walking through that building, that beautiful cathedral, it was really interesting. So it started being built in 1907. They did not finish it until 1990, I believe.
That's typical for cathedrals.
Yeah.
They take 100 years or more.
But I've also had the privilege to be in some of the great cathedrals in Germany, say the Berliner Dome, for example. I was in the monastery where Martin Luther preached his first sermon. And I've been in cathedrals in France and in the Czech Republic. And there's something about that, you know, lifting up that magnificent structure as a place of worship. But that said, when we talk about the church and the tradition that I'm a part of now.
Which one is that, by the way?
Do you know, I would call it non-denominational. I would really say just a follower of Jesus. I wouldn't say, you know, I belong to this one or that one. And I'm welcome at many, and I love to go to many, including the Catholic Church. Do
y'all do snakes?
No.
Darn.
I've never been in a place where they do snakes.
I think that would be so much fun.
But, you know, there is...
Let's go on a field trip to West Virginia.
There is a scripture that says that no poison will harm you, and no, you know, the snakes won't get you either. But I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I want to do that. I'm not going to reach in a bag and grab a snake.
Okay. All right.
But that to say, you know, the church is really the people. It's not the building. The buildings are magnificent and beautiful, and that's not the church. The church is the people. And, you know, I was talking about being in Baltimore a lot.
Hold on. I was actually going to say, it's interesting. I think one of the things about the Catholic Church that appeals to me is that it makes beauty an integral part of its ministry. There was an abbot, Abbot Suger, back in the 1100s, I believe, who he was the mastermind behind building the first Gothic cathedral. And he put it in an interesting way. He said, "The dull mind rises to truth through that which is material," which, you know, was making the case for beauty as an integral part of religious experience.
Do you know, on that topic, there is a church in California, in Los Angeles, near the place where, the Chinese part of town. And that church was built by Amy Semple McPherson, who was a very charismatic, tending toward Pentecostal minister during the Depression. And when that cathedral was raised up, it was raised up in the midst of poverty as a witness to the power of God. But the other thing, as I was there, it was actually just a year ago, some of the decorations on the walls inside that place were things like wheelchairs and crutches as a witness and testimony to the people that were healed by the power of God, healed supernaturally. They came in on crutches and in wheelchairs and walked out the door totally healed.
Are you sure these things aren't supposed to happen in the modern world?
They're not, but they do.
Yes, Yeah, in fact, I have a future podcast guest who's going to attest to that. Is there anything for you that comes to mind on this theme of why a strong spiritual orientation is so important in the public sphere?
Oh my, I could just say it just because.
Well, it's obvious, isn't it?
It's obvious to me. It's not obvious to everyone.
Yeah, in fact, I think a lot of people are threatened by that prospect. They feel like
so?
somehow their rights will be infringed, or let's put it this way. Their secular faith will be infringed upon. Somebody said everybody's got a religion.
Yeah,
it's just, you just choose choose which one. And, I think these days, a lot of people have a very secular faith in progress. That everything that we do just, golly gosh, makes things better every day, which is a crackpot idea because, you just look at history and it's not a linear path from the caves to the stars. A lot of it is cyclical. And in fact, we're starting to realize that the stars aren't an option for us. Stars are for the angels. They're not for humans. Get out past the Van Allen belt, nothing but hard radiation. We ain't going anywhere. We're supposed to be here.
I've heard it said this way, that in many of the faith traditions that the role of man is to sacrifice things for God or the gods, Hindu, Buddhism, whatever that is. But that's the thing that's powerful about Christianity, is that God sacrificed for us.
That's a great point. It's one I've never heard made. Shelley, unless you have anything else, I will conclude the podcast.
Do you know?
Oh, you do have something else.
I am going to add this because we started talking about that role in government, and
please do.
We shifted. I was on a plane to France quite a while back, and there was a gentleman in the seat beside me who was a government professor at George Washington University. We got into this conversation about when we were, imposing our kind of principles on other nations, and in particular in the Middle East. And the man said to me this. He said, whatever we do there is not going to work with regard to democracy. And I said, and why is that? He said, there's one thing that's required for a democracy to work and to flourish. And, I guessed a couple of things, but his answer was this: it requires a Judeo-Christian ethic. And it requires that because the people submit themselves to the will of the law and submit themselves to one another. And I would say in Christianity, we're asked to do that. We're asked to submit ourselves one to another, to love one another, to care for one another. And so that's how I'd like to end this podcast. You're the host, but I think that's a powerful statement.
I do too, because that's consistent with my knowledge of history. Democracy in the ancient world was, for good reason, considered a crackpot idea, because everyone saw what happened to the Greeks. They couldn't make it work, and yet we have. And I think you're absolutely right. I think you supplied the missing ingredient. So, Shelley, thanks very much for talking with me today about why a strong spiritual orientation is so important in the public sphere.
Chris, it's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, too. This concludes another session of the Recivilized podcast. To hear more sessions with various guests, visit the Recivilized website at www.recivilized.site.